guys, it's Shadow the Rat, and for today's video, we're going to talk all about rat tails. So I know that the rat tail is something that a lot of people don't view in the best light, so I thought it would be good to do a video on rat tails and also make it informative for any pet owners who have any concerns about them or just are curious about some things about the rat's tails. So rat's tails have two main functions. The first one is balance, and the second one is temperature regulation. So for balance, you'll notice that your rats often hold their tails out or to the side in order to help them balance when they're climbing on things, especially on very small surfaces. And on top of that, when your rats are off balance, you can tell because they'll be waving their tail all around, trying to regain that balance. And you especially see this with rats when you first start to pick them up like this. So if you're picking them up like this and they don't feel very balanced, you often see their tail moving around. As far as temperature regulation goes, rats are usually furred animals. So you can see here they have a lot of fur on them. All wild rats that are healthy will have fur, and in our domestic rats even, they usually have fur. And so they aren't really good at dispersing heat. And rats typically don't do great in really warm environments. They actually do better in the cold. And so when it comes to warm environments where they are really hot and they need to get rid of some heat, their only option really is to disperse it from their paws and their tail. And these, of course, are the only areas that aren't really covered with fur, and so they are the best areas at dispersing heat. And they actually have a major blood vessel in their tail, which when it's really hot will expand to allow them to release more heat through the tail, and when it's really cold, it will contract in order to preserve body heat. Anyways, we just talked about what rat tails are for, so now let's talk about what's normal for them. Now, rat tails are actually covered in a bunch of fine scales, so you can kind of see here that the scales are all going in this direction, and they are also all covered in this fine layer of hair. And rat tails can also vary a lot in color. You have the pale pink that lighter color rats typically have, you have the kind of grayish pink that rats that are kind of mid-color have, and then you also have rats with darker tails and black tails like Miss Donut here. And you can also find variations. Sometimes rats with different patterns will have tails that are two different colors. Like my girl Oreo, she was a black hooded rat, and she had a tail that was half black and half pink, which was pretty cool looking. Anyways, when rats are babies, you might notice that their tails are typically very clean. You can't really see too well here, I know, because her tail is, of course, colored green, and that's because I was trying to tell her and her identical sister apart. But anyways, like I was saying, younger rats' tails tend to be more clean looking, and this is because rats don't usually groom their tails very much, so when they get older, they tend to build up stains. Now, they do usually clean them enough that this doesn't build up to unbearable levels. If it's actually caked on there, you will have to help them get it off, which is usually best done by soaking their tail under some warm water, then using a fine toothbrush and going in the direction of the scales in order to help get all that gunk off. But for most rats, you don't have to worry about that because they will clean their tail, not super well, but they'll clean it enough that you don't need to worry about doing any sort of maintenance yourself. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about that's normal to see in rats, but can be kind of freaky the first few times you see it, is what's called nail tail. Nail tail is basically when your rats have a buildup on the end of their tail. Usually it looks like a white nail growing out of their tail. It's actually just a buildup of dead skin cells. So if you see it, it's completely normal. It's nothing to worry about. It does look pretty weird. It will naturally come off as the rats molt, and trying to remove it will be very painful on them, so you just want to leave it. By the way, please thank Pickles for her beautiful tail, showing us that nail tail. Anyways, the next thing I wanted to talk about is two serious issues that can happen with rat tails. The first is what's known as degloving, and the second is called ringtail. So degloving basically means that your skin is coming off your bone, and it applies to other parts of the body, not just the tail. But in the case of rats, it's a bit special because the skin on their tail that's covering their bone is especially prone to ripping and coming off the bone. And this is just a survival tactic in order to survive predators grabbing them by one of their weakest points. So if the tail skin comes off and the predator is just left with the skin, then that is considered a win because they got away and survived. The problem is that once a rat's tail skin degloves, it will not grow back. They're not like lizards. They cannot grow back their tails. And on top of that, the bone that's left exposed is at high risk for infection. Plus, of course, it's also very painful, so it's just not a good time all around. Now, the treatment for degloving depends on how severe it is. If it's very mild, your vet's probably going to give you some sort of pain medicine. They might give you some ointment for the tail, but otherwise they might tell you that the bone just has to die and will drop off. And that's in the case of very mild deglovings, just the tip. But if it's anything more than just the tip, then you will likely need to have the exposed bone amputated. And this is a surgery where your vet vet will amputate the bone that is exposed. So this is something that's necessary in these cases, simply because you don't want the bone to be infected. And if your rat's tail degloves in the middle of the night, or you just can't get to the vet right away, then you want to put them in a 1-level cage on some paper towel or blanket, anything that can't get stuck to their tail. You can also give them some pain medication like infant Motrin or children's Tylenol, and I will have a link to my website with the medicine dosing charts on there if you want some help with that. But other than that, you want to keep them alone so the other rats don't aggravate the wound, and you just want to make sure that they stay as calm as possible until they can get to the vet. With that being said, you might wonder, how do deglovings happen? Well, usually it's an accident. Again, like I said, the rat tail skin is very easy to rip off the bone, so if they get caught under something and the rat is just pulling and trying to get away, then it can easily rip off. Now, the one easily preventable way of degloving a rat's tail is to grip their tail at above the halfway point. So if you're gripping their tail by above the halfway point and you're trying to pull them up with it, that is a very risky thing to do, not only because it's very scary and stressful for the rats, but also because that's putting a lot of pressure on their tail, and their tail is, again, very prone to having the skin break off the bone. So if you ever have to grip your rat by the tail, then you want to be grabbing the base. So this is the base, because this area is the strongest part and where the tail is not going to deglove from. You don't want to be grabbing more than 1/4 of the way up, and ideally you should only be grabbing at the base. And you shouldn't be just holding your rat by the base of their tail, because again, this is very stressful on them. It's not a good way to hold them, and it's only a way that you see done in like feeder shops and pet stores when people are nervous about touching the rats. But you shouldn't be doing this with them because it's super uncomfortable. So if you have to hold them by the base of the tail, which I have only really done with skittish rats, but in that case you'd want to hold their feet on your hand, and you'd want to hold the base of the tail, because like you can see here, when I'm holding the base of her tail, she can't get away. Now I am going to let her go, of course, because she doesn't like that. Usually I would be doing that against my chest, so their legs would be against my chest, my hand cupping the back of them, and my other hand would hold the base of the tail. And this is just a good way to ensure that a skittish rat or a new rat doesn't dive bomb and fall to the floor and potentially hurt themselves, and that's the only sort of situation in which I would hold them by the tail in order to ensure that they don't accidentally jump and hurt themselves really badly. That's pretty much all I wanted to talk about when it comes to degloving. So the next thing I want to talk about is ringtail. And ringtail is basically when your rat's tail starts to develop these rings on it with these swellings in between. And it's caused by a lack of humidity, either in their diet or environment. So it's most often seen either with rat pups that aren't getting enough milk or getting enough water in their supplemental formula. And this applies to older rats as well. Of course, they are not going to have as much issue with water, but if they don't have access to clean water, or if they don't know how to use their water bottles, this can be an issue, or if they're eating a food that isn't nutritionally complete. And they should also be living in an area that isn't too dry. If it's too dry, then you can add some humidity by having some humidifiers that you run next to the rat cage on occasion. And if your rat does develop ringtail, it's pretty painful to them because their tail becomes very sore and oozing. So in that case, you want to take them to the vet so they can be prescribed some sort of pain medication. And in addition to this, you will probably have to add some more humidity to their environment through humidifiers, and you'll probably also want to moisturize their tail. Usually this is done with coconut oil or olive oil, and if you use these, I suggest that you take your rat out and rub it on, and then keep them separate from the other rats for about 30 minutes to an hour. And this is just because rats really like the taste of coconut oil and olive oil, so they can harass the cage mate that is covered in the stuff, which isn't great for them. It can be very stressful, especially if they already have a sore tail. So I would just keep them separate so that the oils can absorb, and then after that you can put them back together. So yeah, that's pretty much it for ringtail, and really for this tail video in general. Hopefully this video was helpful for anyone who was curious about rat tails and what can go on with them. If you want to recommend me something to do a topic on, feel free to write it in the comments, but other than that, I will see you later. So yeah, thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you next time. Bye!